All right, let's wrap this up with Nietzsche and Lewis. Okay, so we are beginning here with term 75, the genealogy of morals. Hopefully, you recognize that title as the main book we read by Nietzsche. Really, the only thing we read by Nietzsche were two essays in the genealogy of morals. So, this book is Nietzsche's attempt to figure out what morals are in the absence of God. So I hope you'll remember from Nietzsche that Nietzsche is our most realistic atheistic philosopher of the 19th century. He dies in 1900, which could make him a 20th century philosopher if we wanted to really just stretch to put him in closer to modernity. But Nietzsche's whole conviction is that most people are illogical. And most people are holding on to a system of morals that is based on the existence of God. But most people no longer believe in God. So Nietzsche then raises the obvious question, why should you hold on to those morals in the absence of God? Nietzsche is best defined as an amoral philosopher. He's not an immoral philosopher necessarily, though I would argue his ideas lead one to become immoral. But he himself embraces an amorality, a moral neutrality, really because he thinks that if really God does not exist and has never existed, so there has to be some other origin to our morals. And the genealogy of morals is an attempt to trace that alternative origin story. So the question then of morals is not, for Nietzsche, he's really rejecting the biblical account of Moses ascending Mount Sinai and returning with the Ten Commandments, and that those become the foundation of Western morality. Nietzsche would see that as really hogwash, because God is not real. So in which case, why did Moses impose these rules on the Israelites? And that, for Nietzsche, is a much more interesting question. Which takes us into term 76. Genealogy as a philosophic method is the attempt to trace the lineage of an idea and to figure out what ultimately are the material causes of that idea. So genealogy, in terms of people, is trying to trace back the family history of a person, while Nietzsche is trying to trace back the idea history of an idea, or the ideological history of an idea. And in doing that, he's going to offer some new answers that have not been given before. And that then takes us to term 77. The idea of a master race morality as opposed to term 78, a slave race morality. Nietzsche uses these terms to describe the two different kinds of moral systems that he sees. He sees a master race morality that is a set of moral standards that encourages and enables one group of people to conquer another group of people. And this master morality allows for the enshrining of the qualities that enable conquering as being good. Martial strength, military vigor, great athletic prowess, the courage to kill another human being. These are things that Nietzsche would say, those are what mark out the master race. And that the master race, by virtue of conquering, then establishes those things as being the good things. Those are the virtues they want to encourage. Well, in contrast to, he says, there's also a slave race morality, where the slave race morality is formed through term 82, resentment. Well, through this resentment, the slave race, who is they are conquered by the master race, they then form an opposite morality. If the master race is going to enshrine pride as a virtue and say that you should value yourself so highly and see yourself as worthy of conquering other people, well, the slave race is going to resent that, and the slaves are going to say, no, pride is a vice and humility is a virtue. Where the master race might say that that speed in killing is a great thing, well, the slave race is going to say, no, murder is bad, don't murder. So these two are formed antagonistically in opposition to each other. Well, let's take a look at term 79, priestly morality. The priestly morality is the idea that the priest class in Old Testament Israel really gives the authoritative religious support to the slave morality. And the priests then say that God has baptized the slave morality with all of the strength and vigor of religious fervor. That then leads us to term 80, the revolt of the slaves and morals. And this is a moment where Nietzsche says, he traces this back to ancient Israel and sees it culminating in Christianity, where really the slave morality conquers the master morality. Now note, we're not talking about slaves politically conquering the masters, but instead we are describing describing the master morality being conquered by the slave morality, where suddenly pride is no longer a virtue. Now pride is a vice, and humility is the virtue. Murder is not the virtue, but avoiding murder is in fact the virtue. And it's the changeover of these values that Nietzsche calls, in term 84, the transvaluation of values. Now, Nietzsche sees this culminating in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. He's term 81. Nietzsche believed that Jesus was his only worthy opponent, and part of that was because Jesus represented the ultimate in the slave morality, where the master morality might articulate something like, take an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, like the Old Testament contains. Jesus says things like, if one man slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other cheek also. If a man makes you walk a mile and give you his cloak, or give him your cloak, well, go ahead and give him your undershirt as well and walk with him 2 miles. Jesus extends the moral dimension much further, and Nietzsche then sees Jesus as being the culminating vision of the slave morality. Now, jump down to term 83, where in term 83 we have the idea of the blonde beast. Hopefully you'll remember that this is Nietzsche's idea of a lion, where this lion is a strong, vicious creature which attacks the weak. Well, similarly, Nietzsche argues, there are still masters among us, natural masters, who really they are always going to rise to the top, and they cannot be held to the low morality of the slaves. So just like you would not fault a lion for killing a sick gazelle, you should not fault Napoleon Bonaparte for taking over the sickly parts of Europe, or perhaps past Nietzsche's day, Adolf Hitler for not following any kind of traditional moral standards. Okay, jump down to term 85. Then 85 and 86 are a pair of opposites Nietzsche brings up, where we've got Judea as the representation of the slave morality, and we've got Rome as the representation or the symbol of the master morality. And Nietzsche argues that history is the constant struggle between these two different views, where Judea and Rome are at odds with each other, and the question is, which will triumph? Of course, in Nietzsche's day, he looked around and saw that Judea had almost completely wiped out Rome. Everywhere he looked, he saw people argue for these slave morals that they say are founded ultimately in the goodness defined by God, but they no longer believe in God. So then the logic no longer holds. Term 87 is Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon is the one that Nietzsche pointed to say, here is a master close to our own day. The last gasp of the master morality, Nietzsche thought, was in fact Napoleon. Now, and we've got 2 more terms for Nietzsche at the top of the last page of your review worksheet. So let's pick up the ideas of justice and mercy in Nietzsche's thought. Now, justice in Plato has something to do with wisdom and virtue and balance and what one person owes another person. Justice in Nietzsche's thought is nothing but the pain demanded by the powerful when the weak violate the powerful's expectations. Justice is what the powerful people have decided you owe society when you break the rules that they have set up. Justice for Nietzsche is not objective, it's entirely subjective based on who is in power. So if a different group comes to power and sets up and writes a different set of laws, we have a new standard of justice. Now, in contrast then, Nietzsche then sees, well, not in contrast, but then Nietzsche sees mercy, term 89, as being a sign of a sick society that is on the decline. Mercy for Nietzsche represents a society that's gotten so big and so powerful, it thinks it can basically let its guard down and let people not be punished as much. So mercy is going to be a sign of societal weakness. Now, of course, both justice and mercy in Nietzsche's thought are completely opposed to their understanding in traditional Christian thought. Which brings us to our last philosopher this year. It's been a great year, and we starting with Plato and ending with C.S. Lewis kind of wraps this all up because Lewis brings quite a bit of Plato's theory back into the tradition. So, term 90 is the abolition of man, and you hopefully will recognize that as the set of 3 lectures that we read by C.S. Lewis. He delivered those in 1942. And Lewis's goal in the abolition of man was really to describe the traditional view and articulate the traditional view of ethics in the modern day, and really make an argument for why holding to traditional morality is essential for human nature. So, the first 2 terms under that, 91 and 92, objective fact and subjective feeling, are quite essential for getting at what Lewis is doing. Because Lewis believes that there are objective values to be seen, and that often when we are talking about other things, we are really describing objective values. But then there are also subjective feelings that we have. And we have things that we feel internally that no one else can verify, but we can't mistake an objective fact for a subjective feeling or a subjective feeling for an objective fact. If we lose the distinction between these two, we've lost something critical to our human nature. And this is the problem that Lewis saw in the Green Book, where Gaius and Titius were really they were trying to replace a statement of objective value and say that that was actually a subjective feeling on the original speaker's behalf. Which brings us to term 93, the doctrine of objective value. Well, the doctrine of objective value states that there really are objective values. They really do exist, and when we make statements of value, we can then say whether those statements are true or false based on how well they correspond to reality. If I was to say that the horse is tired, I am attempting to state that the horse really is tired. I'm not saying I feel like the horse is tired. Now, that statement of objective value becomes critical. And the place we look for to compare it then, in Lewis's thought, is the Tao. Now, it's important to keep in mind that Lewis is not, he is not using this word in accordance with the Chinese religion of Taoism, but instead, Lewis is using that word Tao to name a certain way of thinking about ethics. Lewis argues that if we take every pre-modern civilization and lay their ethical writings side by side, we should see massive, massive agreement. Different words, different metaphors, but everybody agreeing on the same idea. That agreement then tells us that each of these civilizations are looking at the same moral reality. And because of that, they're not making things moral or immoral, they're looking at the same moral fabric of the universe. And in doing that, then, we can get a great picture of what traditional morality is by consulting the Tao. Lewis believes that we actually are all within the Tao, and that the Tao becomes inescapable, because the only way to truly critique a moral position is to assert that that moral position is ignoring what is morally true, which you can only do within the Tao. If you try to set yourself outside the Tao, you lose anything beyond your personal feelings to critique another person's moral statement. Well, now, that brings us to term 96, Lewis's Platonic anthropology, where Lewis argues that we human beings have 3 pieces. Those 3 pieces are the head, or the intellect, the chest, or the seat of desires, and the belly, the location of our appetites. This Platonic anthropology gives us the core of what it means to be human. Now, the chest then mediates the other 2. The chest is the governing capacity of those other 2. It's the location of convictions and feelings that really tell us whether or not we control our appetites or we give in to our appetites. It's those convictions or feelings that tell us whether that is a good idea or a bad idea. Uh, Now, Lewis's problem with term 98, the innovators, is that they destroy the idea of objective values that create the chest that governs the head and the belly. And that leads us to term 97, where Lewis looks around at modernity, and he argues in 1942 that modern education and modern values have actually led to a generation who he calls men without chests, men without strong convictions. One of my favorite parts of Lewis is where he actually argues, you know what? People say that the trouble is that if we really embrace this, that people will be too passionate. And he says, I don't see that problem. I don't see that being our issue. Our problem is not that we are overly passionate. Our problem is we no longer think there's anything worth being passionate about. And I will just lay my cards on the table and say that I think I see the exact same thing in the year 2018. We do not suffer from an overabundance of passion. We suffer from not being really sure that there are things worth caring about. So Lewis says, and I would be in agreement with him, that he would rather have people who are overly passionate and who have strong convictions. They have chest governing them, and they are willing to die for their convictions. He would rather have that and say that he needs to tell them that their convictions are wrong and they need better convictions than to have men without chests. I think that really is our dilemma today. So, all right, so take a look at term 99, the idea of the abolition of man. This is going to tie in closely with term 100. Is that the abolition there is looking at the idea of the abolishing or the getting rid of, the extinguishing of man, that really through science, because term 100 means knowledge is power, that's scientia potentia est, that knowledge and science put together can free us from our human limitations. Well, Lewis argues that in a lot of ways, our world has already been freed from specific limitations. We talked about the airplane and we talked about contraception here. But that when we get to the abolition of man, the abolishing, the ending, the erasing of human nature, the getting rid of all the limitations on us as human beings, what we actually do then is destroy human nature. And now that, and then what that functionally does is it turns all of the power to define humanity and decide what we ought to be and what we ought to know over to this small group that Lewis interchangeably calls the controllers or the innovators in term 98. If we are not content to be within the Tao, where in this older tradition that has lots of freedom but also has lots of moral rules, Lewis says we are then left at the point of handing over all the authority of defining what the good is over to a small group of scientific innovators who have no conception of real human life. That then for Lewis is the danger there. And I argued in class that this is pretty much exactly what happened in Stalinist Russia, where in the name of getting rid of human distinctions in society, Russia handed all the power over to the Communist Party, and the Communist Party remade Russia in the Communist Party's image. And in doing so, really destroyed lives for upwards of between 50 and 100 million people over the course of 80 years. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that is the conclusion of our third philosophy review video. I hope this has been helpful to you. I have very much enjoyed having the chance to study philosophy with you this year. I feel like I have learned a lot from each of your insights in class, and I thank you for your work and your diligence this year, and I look forward to seeing you all back next year for senior seminar, where we will have the joy of writing the senior theses together and figuring out how you can take all that you've learned and now use it to say something worthwhile. So, best of luck on studying. Please don't forget that your study review packet has 2 parts, both posted to Google Classroom. This video went over everything we covered in class over the past week, but it did not go over all of the passages. You are on your own for reviewing passages and being prepared for the rest of the exam. So, best of luck, and I look forward to seeing you all at the exam and then back in July.